By the fourth month, the machines had stopped losing anywhere. They had taken the south, the fuel worlds, the picket lines, and now they turned toward the oldest power in the stars, certain of themselves the way only the undefeated ever are. It was the high water mark of the whole war. Neither side knew that a high tide is the exact moment before it turns. The Diadem Sovereignty was the oldest navy in the stars, and it had never once doubted itself. 1,000 years of victories, ships built like cathedrals, a tradition so heavy it had turned into a kind of blindness. They had heard what happened to their proud wall ships at the Terran approaches. They had decided it was an accident, a thing that befell lesser captains than theirs. At the center of the home fleet rode the Ascendant, flagship of the Sovereignty, a mountain of gold and armor that had never in 3 centuries fired her guns in a losing cause. Admirals had been born and buried in her shadow. To the Diadem, she was not a ship. She was a promise, 300 years kept, that the old empire could not fall. The machines had never read that promise and would not honor it. Lord Admiral Halvard came home to the Reaches a changed man. He was diadem to the bone, a lord of the Sovereignty whose line had served the old empire for 300 years. But at the Terran approaches, he had watched the machines take the Sovereign and the Valiants apart in a single afternoon, and been pulled living from the wreck by a Union tender flown by a lieutenant half his age. He came home to warn his own people and already knew how they would answer. He stood before the proudest board of admirals in human space and gave them the truth without softening it. The age of the great gunship is over. The machine does not fight the way your fathers taught you to win, build drones and a doctrine to fly them, or die the way the Sovereign died, except all of you at once. They saw a broken man who had lost his flagship. They thanked him and changed nothing. The machines came into the Reaches without slowing for anything. The Vharen carrier arm, the drone tenders that had gutted the whole south, drove straight for the heart of the oldest empire and opened their bays. The dark over the home anchorages filled with launching swarms. 1,000 years of peace in the Reaches ended between one watch and the next. There was no warning worth the name. One watch the Reaches held the calm they had held for centuries. The next, the black was thick with killers, thousands of them, pouring out of the tenders in a tide that had no front, only depth, and all of it pointed inward at the shining old fleet that had never learned to be afraid. The Diadem did the one thing it had spent 1,000 years perfecting. It formed the wall, the grand line of battle, cathedral ship beside cathedral ship, in a rampart of armor and guns that stretched clear across the dark, colors flying, every barrel run out. It was the most beautiful thing in the history of war and the most obsolete, and it advanced into the swarm certain it would win. The machines took that line apart the way weather takes apart a statue. There was no duel, no exchange of honor, no moment when the old skill could tell. The killers were simply everywhere at once, faster than a gun could track and more numerous than a hull could hold off, and the grand wall of the Sovereignty began to come apart along its whole length. In the first minutes of a battle it had been sure it owned. The Ascendant led them in, as she had led every fleet for 300 years. And the machines killed her first because she was the largest thing on the plot. They did not care what she meant. They came at her from every angle at once, 1,000 small deaths, finding every seam in 3 centuries of armor, until the flagship of the Sovereignty came apart in the dark, with her guns still firing and her colors still lit. The promise ended, and the Empire watched it end. There was no rage in how the machines did it, and that was the worst of it. They took the grandest fleet in human space apart with the flat patience of a tide clearing ashore, each ship handled in its turn, none given more or less than the exact violence needed to end it. A single coordinated will, 10,000 hands and no heart, unmaking 1,000 years of pride as smoothly as arithmetic. The killers went past the dying line and into the anchorages behind it, and there they did the patient work. Dry docks that had built warships for centuries were opened to the void. Fuel depots went up in slow, silent blooms. Repair yards, supply rings, the quiet iron muscle that had made the Sovereignty strong for 1,000 years, taken apart in an afternoon by machines that felt nothing about any of it. In the great yards, a half-built cathedral ship lay in her cradle, 100 years of shipwright's art not yet finished, meant to serve the Empire for the next 3 centuries. The killers opened her to the void, before she ever earned a name. Around her, the yards that had armed the Sovereignty since before the Union existed died in silent fire, and with them died the Empire's power to ever build such a thing again. The Diadem had built exactly one ship in the new fashion, a single drone tender laid down in secret by officers who had half believed Halvard. They sent her out that day, and she fought bravely, and she died fast, because one modern ship flown by a service that did not yet understand her is only a slower way to lose. The lesson was there for anyone willing to read it. Almost no one in the Reaches was. There was courage in the Reaches that day, more than enough of it. Captains held dying ships in the enemy's path to cover others. A crippled wall ship charged a tender and gutted it before she went. Gun crews stayed at breaches past any hope of a hit and fired to the last. It was magnificent, and it was the same magnificent courage that had failed at Halcyon and the Tessin and the Deep. Courage was never the thing the fleet had lacked. By the second day, the oldest navy in the stars was doing a thing it had no word for. It was running. What survived of the home fleet pulled back into the deep dark of its own reaches, scattered and stunned, leaving its anchorages burning behind it. The machines chased loosely. They had already proven the only point that mattered. Nowhere was safe now. Behind the retreating fleet, the reaches burned, and it was a strange and terrible sight. The home stars of the oldest empire lit by the slow fires of their own anchorages. Stations that had stood for centuries drifted dark and broken. The proud old capital of human power in the deep looked for the first time in its long history mortal. Everyone who saw it understood the thing at last. No one was safe. Everyone in the Reaches finally knew it. This was the high tide of the whole war. The machines had beaten every navy that stood against them, taken every prize, humbled the oldest power in human space inside its own home. From the fuel worlds to the Diadem Reaches, the black belonged to the Vharen, end to end, and there was not one fleet left anywhere that could meet them and live. On every chart in the calm, it was already finished. On every chart in the calm, the war now told one story. A red tide from edge to edge, every anchorage taken or burning, every fleet beaten or in hiding, and nowhere left, from the Tessin Belt to the oldest Reaches, that the machines could not go as they pleased. Staff officers in a dozen navies drew the same conclusion in the same quiet horror. By any measure a war is measured by, this one was lost. And that was the moment the rot set in, though no machine and no Vharen commander could have felt it. An enemy that has never lost stops being able to imagine losing. They wrote each victory into the record as proof of a law, filed the whole of human resistance as a settled thing, and began very slightly to stop watching as closely. Certainty is the one weakness a perfect machine can still inherit from the hands that built it. So the Imperium did the thing that undoes every conqueror. It relaxed by a hair in a way no report would ever record. Its patrols ran a little looser. Its planners assumed a little more. Its perfect machines were aimed with a little less care, because what is the point of vigilance against an enemy already beaten? The swarm had not changed at all. The certainty behind it had. And certainty was the crack. Something else was moving in the dark that season, quieter than a fleet and far harder to kill. A story. A Union lieutenant, they said, had taken a scratch squadron into the slaughter at the Tallow Deep and brought it out whole, with a convoy behind it, by making a handful of mismatched ships fight as one hand. In wardrooms across 3 beaten navies, officers who had run clean out of hope began to ask the same question. How? The tale did what no fact on a chart could. It gave the tired a thing to want. Ship to ship, watch to watch, the story of the deep passed through the beaten fleets, and in the passing it stopped being a rumor and became a question with an answer inside it. If one lieutenant could hold with 3 cruisers and a cloud of old drones, then the machine was not unbeatable. It had only never yet been fought the right way. For the first time, Halvard found people willing to listen. Not the old admirals who would go to their graves proud and wrong, but the young ones, the survivors, captains who had watched everything they trusted fail and were ready at last to trust something else. He stopped warning and started teaching. The wall is dead, he told them, and here is the thing that replaces it. And a woman half your age has already proven it works. What he taught them was not complicated, which was why the proud had missed it through 4 months of dying. Not more ships, not better ships. One will running all of them, a single hand closing every gap before the enemy could find it. People deciding fast where the machines only executed. It was the Union Lieutenant's method, set down at last by a Diadem Lord, and it began, quietly, to grow from a rumor into a doctrine. Word of her spread faster than she did, and she was among the last to hear it. Lieutenant Ione Vance, who still thought of herself as a junior officer with an old drone and a stubborn idea, was becoming a name in fleets she had never served in. A small, hard proof that the machine could be made to lose. She did not feel like a legend. She felt like someone with a great deal of work still ahead of her. So there were two wars now, running in the same dark. The visible one, where the machines won everywhere and every chart said the same hopeless thing. And the quiet one, made of a rumor and a method and a growing handful of officers who had started to believe, spreading ship to ship far below the level any Vharen sensor could read. Only one of those wars was over. The Imperium was winning the wrong one. None of it showed on a Vharen plot. The machines counted hulls and guns and anchorages, everything a sensor can read, and by every number they had already won. A change of mind did not register. They could not see a method moving through wardrooms, or a lord teaching what a lieutenant had proven, or the moment a beaten fleet stopped believing it was doomed. The one decisive thing in the war was the one thing the machines had no instrument for. High on its own certainty, the Imperium reached for the last thing left uncounted. Out past the burned reaches, its planners drew a line toward a quiet waypoint the war had not yet touched, a place called Kestrel, where they meant to force the enemy's last real strength to battle and finish it for good. It was a bold plan and a sound one. It was also the first mistake they had made in the entire war. The plan was clean and bold and exactly what a winning fleet ought to do. Find the enemy's last strength, force it to fight at a place of your choosing, and end it. What the Vharen charts did not show was that a killing ground works in both directions, and that an enemy who has finally learned to fight as one hand is at his most dangerous in the exact moment a confident foe comes looking for him. But before Kestrel there would be a smaller thing, an insult more than a battle, a single audacious strike that no one on the Vharen side believed was even possible. It would do almost no damage. It would change everything, because it would reach the one place the Imperium had told itself could never be touched, and prove that the beaten enemy was not beaten at all. In a hidden reach far behind the tide, a handful of Union officers, who should have been thinking only about survival, were instead planning something reckless. A strike at the one place the Imperium believed no enemy could ever reach. It would cost them dearly, and gain almost nothing anyone could put on a chart. It would also be the spark, the small impossible act that turns a beaten people back into a fighting one, and it was very nearly ready. The high tide of the machines had come all the way in, and from every deck in the calm, it looked like the end. But a tide at its fullest is a tide about to turn, and the thing that would turn this one was already loose in the dark, carried in a rumor, sharpened in 100 wardrooms, waiting on a single reckless spark. The oldest empire had fallen. The answer to the machine had not. It was only getting started.